Bluebird was housed. There was a scaffolding construction with a tarpaulin over it, and that's where Bluebird was housed and was launched. There'd be a lot of people around in those days, media, support crew, engineers, all sorts. And then Donald Campbell would turn up in his E-Type Jaguar. Things haven't really changed a lot since those days, apart from the modern cars, and of course the gondola wasn't there in those days. Built in 1979. But Donald Campbell would, as I said, launch the Bluebird there, and then he'd probably poodle out to the middle of the lake at a very, very gentle speed, something akin to what we're doing at the moment, and his support crew would be already out on the lake. They'd be sweeping for debris, making sure there were no logs in the way. The timekeepers were getting in position. They would have to make sure that there wasn't any forecast of wind. It would have to be a calm day. And the last thing to happen would be the maroon was fired. The marker post for the other end of the kilometre. We can do that really accurately. We can't do it at this end, the marker posts have long since disappeared. But I'll talk about the accident on the way back up the lake. Basically it happened between us and that bit of building work that's going on over there. Lighthouse tree at this end. There's a dip in the middle of the island where the camp would have been. But the secret harbour is actually significant, not because we're going to look into the secret harbour, we can do that on the way back up the lake, but it's the rocks that protect it. The first slabs of rock that you can see there, this is the one place on the lake where a wasp from a first Campbell run might just come back on him, as it were. And we'll get even more of that effect as we come back up the lake. So this real name is Peel Island, P-E-E-L, But Wildcat Island in the Swallows and Amazon stories. Well, the secret harbour is definitely not a secret today. It is actually getting more and more dangerous for those people to jump into the water. They really do have to jump out quite a long way forward to get to deep water. Come on, go on, there we go. There we go. Come on, you can do it. Yesterday there was somebody actually doing a header, a pretty dangerous thing to do, going head first from there. Well done, there we are. Clear as they perhaps sometimes are, but I think this is a cracking view that we're just about to get. It was actually used in a television programme called Britain's Favourite View. The view that actually won that programme, because all programmes have to have a winner nowadays, of course, and all programmes have to have somebody thrown out in the first round and second round. I think you know what I mean. But the view that won it was a view looking up Wastwater. Similar view, but this view looking up Coniston, there are the ancient fells in the far distance and the island as well. That's a lovely view if it weren't quite so hazy, but never mind. Once we go a little bit further, I'll tell you what you're actually looking at. From the very far distance is Grisdale Falls. To the right of that you can actually see the shape of the Fairfield Horseshoe. The prongs of the horseshoe pointing to the right. And the Fairfield is some 300 feet taller than Coniston Old Man, but of course it's further away. To the left of the dip in the skyline, the first little bump that you come to has the lovely name of Dolly Wagon Pike. And then the highest mountain in the area that we can actually see is in the top left-hand corner, in the very far distance. That is Helvellyn, seen from a rather unusual angle. Very well these swimmers and floaty crafty things over on our left hand side. We do get swimmers trying to cross the lake from this point. There is a car park just over here on the left hand side, but we much prefer it when swimmers are towing a float which is bright orange. They're brilliant things. Whoever invented those, they've come along in the last few years. It means we can see the swimmers in the water from a long way away. Much, much safer. wonder if you know anybody who does lake swimming, something like that, and you need an idea for a birthday or Christmas present, you know what to do. But no idea how much they are, but they are lifesavers, I can tell you that. So it's got to be worth it. So it's quite possible that that wall of rock did do something with that first run, the wash, and maybe it was still around. It wasn't in the measured kilometre, but he was just starting to accelerate from this point.
We don't know why he didn't wait. We don't know why he didn't. He was on the boat. He was on the boat.
Over on our left-hand side ahead of us in the trees, there's another example of these houses with lake frontage. There is a slight connection to the Donald Campbell story. In fact, the Campbell story, because Malcolm Campbell knew the original owner of that house, who happened to be a Romanian inventor called George Constantinescu. And during the First World War, Constantinescu came up with a system whereby our fighter pilots could shoot bullets through their own propellers without blasting the blades off. The Germans at the time had a mechanical system, and the British system, so-called at the time, was to sheathe the propellers in brass so that the bullets bounced off, presumably in all directions, which wasn't too popular with the pilots. So Constantinescu came up with an even more efficient system, a hydraulic system of synchronization. He was much valued for that, and in the Second World War there were soldiers positioned in the trees to the right of the boathouse, and their job was to prevent a seaplane from landing and spiriting him off to work for the opposition. Well, of course, no seaplane ever did land, and the soldiers had a pretty cushy time waiting for the tea and biscuits to come from the house. The idea was for Sir Malcolm Campbell to work in Australia. In Western Australia, he took the record up to 276. But although he was confident that he could go faster, he knew very well that he didn't have a faster car. And the Americans had taken the record, they were going to do it again. He was very, very aware of the Americans taking over the land speed record. So what he had to do was to raise more money to build a better car. So his cunning plan was to come to Coniston and to push that 276 miles an hour way over 300. Then the Americans would go home for the water speed record and give up. He would then get more sponsorship, more money, then he could build a better car to defeat the Americans in the land speed record. So that was why he was here in November 1966. And he started off from Pier Cottage, where we did that pathetic start, 8:41 in the morning, and he came storming down the lake, and his first run was a successful one, 297 miles an hour. So to get his 300 that he wanted, he only needed to go 303 on the way back to get the average of the two runs at 300. Beforehand, I've just gone ahead of myself actually. Before he did that, he had a perfect day, which you've seen in the folder, Christmas Day 1966. That was absolutely perfect. And he went out despite the fact that there were no support crew around, no timekeepers, everyone had gone home for Christmas lunch. But because the weather was fortuitous, he actually went out anyway, just for the heck of it. But because the support crew wasn't there, he couldn't refuel. He had to come straight back on that occasion, on Christmas Day. So that's where he got the idea from. And on January the 4th, he was thinking, what are the advantages, what are the disadvantages of not refueling? So he'd got it in his head already. There were a lot of things in his head at the time. He was running out of money. He was running out of sponsorship money. He was running out of his own money, the family money. He was waiting for the weather to be right. and he was under pressure from the media. The media were not being very kind because they just couldn't understand why he just didn't get on with it, do it. And they were even saying things like, well, perhaps he wasn't the man his father had been, which was particularly unkind. Testing the engine at Pier Cottage was interesting. They tied the boat down to everything they could, and then they fired up the engine, made sure, told everybody to get out of the way. Everybody did, apart from one person, a Canadian cameraman who was standing on the jetty, but not for long. So they had to fish him out of the water, and when they'd done that, they heard a rather grinding sound, and the engine had ingested its own intake blades. So they had to go and get another one, which took time, even more annoying the press people. But eventually, as I said, he had this Christmas Day run. At one point he hit a bird, at one point he hit a duck. He didn't seem too bothered about, well, he certainly wasn't bothered about the bird or the duck, but he wasn't bothered about bashing out the dents either that he got. He was also under pressure because of the London Boat Show. Now the boat show was due to start on January the 4th, the day he died. The idea was for him to have broken the record in November or December and then take Bluebird down to the boat show to display in triumph. But that hadn't happened. So the next best thing would be to do the record on the day of the opening and then telephone the news through to the opening ceremony of the boat show. So that's why Campbell was out so early in the morning at 8:41. So, right, I'm back on track again now. So he's coming down towards us, successful run, 297 miles an hour, turn around near the island. Are you refueling, Skip? No, coming straight back. So that's what he did, because of the idea that had been planted in his head from the Christmas Day run. He could have been affected by that wasp from the island, which we passed quite closely. But at this point he was probably doing a peak speed, that's not an average speed, but a peak speed of 328 miles an hour. That was worked out later on because they couldn't measure his true speed. At this point also he would be just about to re-enter the measured kilometre. And the kilometre marker posts that I promised you are just over there. You'll see them. It's a grey post right on the shoreline. And as we get closer, you'll see it's in the shape of an elongated letter V. As we get even closer, you should see the other one in the trees behind it. This is where the Swiss timekeepers would have sat behind the two markers. They would line them up rather like rifle sights. And then in this case they would start their timing equipment as Bluebird flashed by. Okay, there's the second one in the trees behind. You can just see it. So we are re-entering now. It would take Donald Campbell normally 7.5 seconds to complete that measured kilometre. But it usually takes us 7.5 minutes. So we're not far off Donald Campbell's track, that's just a few yards further over into towards the middle of the lake, but at this point also the boat would be starting to tramp, in other words to bounce up and down on its outriggers, its sponsons. And we hear that also in the radio messages that Campbell has with his support crew. I think at one point he says, it's bloody noisy in here. And then finally, the boat does start to move too much, and you hear Campbell's rather poignant message that says, "I'm going," and then gone. The boat, as you know, flipped off and went backwards, almost did a complete backward somersault. That would have been a miracle had it successfully done that. Apparently, one of the other special things at the time was the silence after the screaming of the jet engine, the splash, and then the ominous silence. And there was an even more poignant message that I can remember, and that was from one of the support crew, and that says, "Complete accident, I'm afraid." It was obvious that there was really no chance. It was said at the time that Donald Campbell had half an hour's oxygen that he could have used, gone down to the lake bed and been recovered, but it was the accident that actually killed him. He would have had no chance. I think he was probably dead before he hit the water. Floating to the surface, as well as Mr. Woppet, you've seen, were a lot of plastic balls and bags. They were used for flotation. And like all teddy bears should be, Mr. Woppet was rescued, and as you can see from the photograph, he went to Donald Campbell's funeral in Gina Campbell's handbag, Gina being the daughter. Police divers arrived, but they did not have the capability to go down to 144 feet. It was the next day that the Navy divers came, and they had the equipment to get down to those depths, and they went down to recover Donald Campbell's body. They found the boat with no difficulty at all, but they couldn't find his body. And so they came back and reported that it was likely to be trapped underneath the boat. That's when his widow, Tonya, said, "Right, leave him there, that's his final resting place, let's just leave him in peace." And so it was for many, many years. Amateur divers couldn't get down to those depths in those days. But of course, technology moves on, and more recently, the family noticed the growing risk that somebody might eventually go down and start snipping bits off the boat for souvenirs. So they changed their minds, and they allowed the recovery. That was done on March the 8th, 2001. The boat was lifted using compressed air, and in fact taken back to Coniston completely underwater. We didn't see any of the boat at all until the tail fin broke the surface, right back at Coniston. And when they'd done that, they couldn't find Campbell's body. It was then that Gina, his daughter, requested that the search continue. She wanted to find her father, she wanted a gravestone that she could visit, she wanted a bit of closure. And so it was 10 weeks later, May the 28th, 2001, that they did actually find Campbell's body. He'd been thrown clear, and he was about 60 metres away from the original wreckage. He was taken back to Coniston, back to Pier Cottage actually, in private, away from prying eyes. And they had to go through all the recognition procedure with DNA and all that sort of thing, but it was obviously him. The funeral was fixed for the 12th of September 2001, and that was an appalling day. It was wet and windy and cold, and already particularly sombre because of the day before. That was 9/11. And that's why Campbell's funeral hardly made the newspapers at all. Didn't make the media because of the dreadful news from the States. This company had the honour of taking Campbell's body in his coffin out to the crash site for one last ceremony on the lake. You've seen the picture of our retired boat, Ruskin, that did that. And he was actually taken up the measured kilometre that he never finished on the day he died. So there's a quiz question for you. How long did it take Campbell to do his last 2 kilometres? 7.5 seconds, 34 years. He was transferred to that glass-sided hearse that you saw in the picture, taken to the cemetery for burial. Now, I wasn't there. wasn't in Coniston at that time, but I am told, it may be a story, I'm told that when the coffin was being lowered into the grave, the wind stopped and the rain stopped and the sun came out. But that might just be a story. The boat is being restored. Now, what's happened to the boat is that she was recovered by a dive team led by a chap called Bill Smith, who also happens to run an engineering works in Tyneside. Over these last 17 years, he's been instrumental in restoring the boat to working order, which was the wish of Gina, the daughter. It's taken that long for two reasons: A, money, and B, it's got to have all the modern health and safety nonsense in it as well. Well, not nonsense, but you know what I mean. It can't just be exactly the same as the original. It's got to be safe. And it has already been tested. Although the engine has anyway. Static engine test has been done. The next thing we know is it's going up to Loch Fad. That's on the Isle of Bute. And it's going to be tested on August the 4th and thereafter for a few days. And then eventually it will come back here to do demonstration runs. But they're allowed to go up to 100 miles an hour before then going on display in the Ruskin Museum. And that will please Gina because she always wanted people to remember her father's achievements rather than remembering the death, the way he died. As far as the record is concerned, Campbell's worry that the Americans would take his record was justified because just 2 months after his death, the Americans did take both the land and water speed records, and then the water speed record went to the Australians. It's currently held by Ken Warby. It was done in Australia, in New South Wales, in 1978, and it currently stands at 317.6 miles an hour. That's the average over the 2 runs. It's not been attempted since then. It's just far too dangerous. Ken Warby's son has said recently that he'd like to have another go. There's talk of a British attempt, there's talk of a New Zealand attempt, and an American one, but we shall see. It has been a very long-standing record. We do, of course, get Australians on board who are very proud of that record that they have. And as they can't be proud about cricket at the moment, they can be proud about that one. But we can do better than that because we can boast about a record done by a member of the Campbell family, even in a historic location as well, because on Pendine Sands recently, Donald Campbell's nephew, Don Wales, did the world record at 87 miles an hour for lawnmowers. Absolutely true. I'm told it was cutting-edge technology. To be able to be a lawnmower, it does have to cut grass, but they do take the blades off to actually race it at 87 miles an hour. I did have a question asked of me once by a lady passenger who regretted her question. She knew exactly what she'd said and wanted the lake to swallow her up. And her question was, well, was it a sit-on lawnmower? It was also suggested to Ken Warby, the Australian record holder, that as well as holding the point-to-point record, he might like to have a go at a circular version. But he didn't like the idea of that too much. He wanted to set the record straight. And going back to the lawnmower, it was also suggested by a passenger, not by me, by a passenger, that they might like to invent a kind of waterborne lawnmower as well, and then they could do it on Grasmere. It's a passenger, not me. Seriously though, I think once 3 things are reunited, that's the village of Coniston, Donald Campbell's body, the boat Bluebird, then they will all constitute a pretty fine memorial to a pretty brave man. So that's what we're all looking forward to. That's Brantwood, by the way. Sorry, John Ruskin's house you were asking about. John Ruskin. That is Brantwood, where Ruskin lived. 1872 until 1900. So it's set up as a kind of museum stroke stately home. I've said quite enough. You don't want to listen to me anymore, so we'll have a bit of peace and quiet. I think I've answered everybody's questions, have I? Any that I can neglect to? If you have